Hi all, we are back for our fourth mini lecture for our spinal cord and somatic reflexes. In this lecture, we are going to start by talking about ascending tracts in general, and then move into more specific information about 3 ascending tracts, and then we'll go into descending tracts and again look at 4 specific descending tracts. I will note that at this point we are going to start sort of seeing connections between the spinal cord and the brain, so you may want to pay attention to those and use them as a way to connect the last week's worth of lecture with this week's worth of lecture. As we talk about our ascending tracts, remember that we are talking about bundles of nerve fibers that are carrying sensory information up the spinal cord and into the brain. When we are looking at these types of tracts, we are going to be involving more than one neuron. So we have multiple synapses that are occurring here. We number them based on sort of where they are. So we have first order neurons, second order neurons, and third order neurons that are going to be part of our ascending tracts. In this case, our first order neurons are going to detect the stimulus and transmit it to the spinal cord or the brainstem. So here we have an example where we have receptors for body movement, limb positions, fine touch discrimination, and pressure. So one of these senses is being triggered, and here's our first neuron. So we're bringing that information into the spinal cord. We have sort of a solid line which indicates that this is one neuron traveling all the way from the spinal cord up into the medulla. This is going to be our first order neuron because it is bringing our sensory information to the spinal cord and or brainstem. From there, our first order neuron is going to synapse with a second order neuron. So think back a couple of chapters and you'll remember that when we're drawing neurons that are synapsing with each other, we have sort of this triangle or arrow shape, and then we have this circle that indicates that we have a synapse. So this would be our presynaptic neuron, and this would be our postsynaptic. So this little circle is indicative of the neurosoma or the soma of that neuron. And this is going to be indicative of where we have our synaptic connection coming from our presynaptic neuron. So here is our synapse between our first order neuron and our second order neuron. Our second order neuron is usually going to continue carrying that information to the thalamus or into our midbrain, okay, depending. Go up through, so this one takes us up through the midbrain and into the thalamus. The thalamus, keep in mind, if you don't remember, that's going to be our gateway to the cerebral cortex. So it is going to take that information and it's going to filter out anything that is unnecessary or unimportant or should be ignored. Assuming that this stimulus or this sensory information is necessary or important for us to integrate and understand, then we will send it on through a third order neuron up into the cerebral cortex. So we go third order neuron, here's our synapse in the thalamus, up to the to the cerebral cortex. So let me sort of just quickly write down what these are. So we get detection of our stimulus and okay, so first order detecting of stimulus and basically taking it to and up the spinal cord. Our second order, we're going to get a synapse somewhere, usually in the brainstem. So a lot of times we'll see that the second order synapses or second order neuron is going to happen in the medulla or start in the medulla. And then it continues to our thalamus. We synapse in the thalamus with our third order neuron, which carries our signal to our cerebral cortex. So here are going to be 2 ascending tracts that we have already talked about. We talked about them when we were looking at the brain. And so we're going to sort of trace them on here. And this is actually what our image is showing us. Oops. Is going to be these 2 columns, right? And so these are going to be in the posterior white matter posterior columns here, and we have the gracile fasciculus, and then the cuneate fasciculus. So the gracile is going to carry information from our lower trunk and limbs. And the cuneate is going to bring in information from our chest and upper limbs. So the type of information that these two columns or ascending tracks are going to be responsible for transmitting would be like vibration, pain, touch, and proprioception, which is all about body position and movement. So then we can use that information to adjust our muscle tone and our balance and our posture and how we coordinate. For this particular, or both of these tracks, we see that our first order neurons are going to go to the medulla, and then they are going to synapse with our second order neurons, and then at that point, the second order neuron is going to decussate. So let's follow this tract again and see what's going on. So we have information coming in the cuneate fasciculus here. So it's coming from the chest or upper limb. Something's happened again. We've changed our limb position and we get some proprioception that tells us that. That information comes into the spinal cord and goes into this tract of white matter. These neurons or nerve fibers are then going to carry that information all the way up to the medulla. We see we're still on the same side of the body here, right? So we are on the posterior side, or so this would be the right side of the body. So we're on the right side of the body. At this point, we get our synapse between our first order and second order neuron. Now, when we look at the second order neuron, we see in the medulla, it starts on the right side, but very quickly it is going to go boom to the left side, and now we're going to carry that information to the left side of the brain. So this is our point of decussation. We also are going to see, maybe you should go back and go through your anatomy of the brainstem again, but we did talk about the medial lemniscus. So we decussate, that second order neuron goes into that medial lemniscus and then is carried up through the midbrain until it reaches the thalamus. In the thalamus, it's going to synapse with a third order neuron and head to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so now that we have sort of a feel for our ascending tract anatomy and what we should expect in terms of neurons, we are going to go through three more. So we are going to talk about the spinothalamic, the spinal-reticular, and the spinocerebellar tracts. What I want to do is just give a little bit of information about what type of sensing these tracts are responsible for, whether they are ipsilateral or contralateral, and where our first and second order neurons occur. So let's see if we can do that with these next three. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our spinothalamic tract. So in our spinothalamic tract, it is going to be responsible for sensing pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. Okay. We are going to see that this is a contralateral tract, which means that it does cross over or decussate from one side of the body to the other. Our first order neurons here are going to actually end in the posterior horn, really close to the entry point. Our second order neurons are then going to be the ones that decussate and lead to the thalamus. Okay, so a little bit different here in terms of where our first and second order neurons are going to be. Our spinal-reticular tract, this is going to be one that senses pain. This one is a little bit unique because it includes fourth order neurons, so we go beyond the third order neuron here. Our first order neurons are again going to enter around the posterior horn and immediately synapse. They do decussate, or I'm sorry, the second order neurons decussate, and they end in the reticular formation. And then our spinocerebellar tract, this one is particularly important in proprioceptive signals. So this is going to be proprioception, that means positioning of our limbs and joints. The first order neurons here are going to originate in the muscles and end in the posterior horn, and then our second order neurons are going to end in the cerebellum. Okay, and this one is ipsilateral, which means that there is no decussation, right? And I guess, let me put on here, this one. Now I know that that's not a ton of detail about these different tracks. I don't want you to get too deep into all of the details about them. Just kind of be familiar in general with the different neurons in their order and sort of where they're located in the spinal column or the spinal cord. So let's see. So here in our posterior column, this is where we're going to have our brachial fasciculus, and then here we have our cuneate fasciculus. Again, those are both posterior, so these are our ascending tracks. Here is going to be one of our spinocerebellar, and there are like posterior and anterior, and I didn't want to get too deep into that. So those are going to be our spinocerebellar tracks. And then here, the spinothalamic and spinoreticular tracts are actually part of a larger system, which is called the anterolateral, and so we can see that is over here. So those are the location of our ascending tracks in the spinal cord. Okay, so I am going to stop this little mini lecture here since we're already 11 minutes in. I'll keep this one pretty short. The next one will also be short because we're just going to talk about the descending tracks. And then in the third one for this sort of series, if you will, we will go over general sort of spinal cord anatomy. And that will be that.